It was the spring of 1983. 6 months since the killings. 6 months, and the Bureau was no closer than they'd been in October. I worked the pacifier between my teeth and looked at the folder. Here's what I knew. September 29th, 1982. A Wednesday morning. A 12-year-old girl in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, a Chicago suburb, woke up with a sore throat. Her parents gave her a single capsule of extra-strength Tylenol, the painkiller that lived in roughly half the medicine cabinets in America. By 7 in the morning, she was on the floor. By the end of the next day, 6 more people were dead. A 27-year-old postal worker in Arlington Heights. The postal worker's brother and sister-in-law, who had taken Tylenol from the same bottle while grieving. A new mother in Winfield. A phone center employee in Lombard. A flight attendant in Old Town. 7 people. 3 days. Different stores. Different bottles. Different parts of the Chicago metropolitan area. Same poison. Inside each capsule, where there was supposed to be acetaminophen, somebody had put potassium cyanide. He had emptied the white powder out and replaced it with a different white powder. He had put the capsules back in the bottles. He had put the bottles back on store shelves. Nobody had seen him do it. 6 months later, with 200 federal agents on the case, nobody had been charged. Nobody ever would be. That's what everybody knew. What was bothering me was what everybody didn't. 3 things since the first week. The geography. He had hit at least 5 different stores in 5 different suburbs on what looked like a single afternoon. That isn't easy. That takes a car, a route, a plan, and the kind of nerve that doesn't sweat at a checkout counter. The timing. The first death was a Wednesday morning. By Friday afternoon, every Tylenol bottle in America had been pulled from store shelves. He had a 48-hour window. He used it. He didn't try to use it longer. And the cyanide. Where he got it. How he weighed it. How he knew exactly how much would kill in a single capsule, and not so little that the victim would taste it and spit it out. That's not a man who picked something up at a hardware store. That's a man who'd done some reading. The girl out front set a folder on the desk and walked back out. A copy of an extortion letter, mailed by a man in New York to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killings. The letter wasn't from the killer. It was from a man named James William Lewis. The Bureau had been chasing him for the last 6 months and had finally caught him in December. He'd been convicted of extortion. He had not, despite the FBI's best efforts, been linked to the murders. Most investigators thought he was the killer anyway. I bit down on the pacifier and turned to the first page. Start with Mary. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. She lived in Elk Grove Village, a quiet suburb northwest of Chicago. On the night of September 28, 1982, she came home from school complaining of a sore throat. Her parents gave her 1 extra-strength Tylenol capsule before she went to bed. Just before 7 the next morning, her father heard a thud from the bathroom. Mary was found on the floor. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was past helping. She was pronounced dead at 9:30 a.m. The doctors thought she'd had a stroke, a 12-year-old with no medical history. It was the kind of thing that didn't happen. It was the kind of thing that meant something else was happening. By midday on the same Wednesday, 20 miles east in Arlington Heights, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus arrived home from his shift, complaining of chest pain. He took 2 extra-strength Tylenol from a bottle in his kitchen cabinet. By 2 in the afternoon, he was dead. His family gathered at his house. His brother Stanley, 25, and his sister-in-law Teresa, 19, drove over to be with their parents. Stanley had a headache from the grief. He went to the same kitchen cabinet his brother had been to that morning. He took 2 of the same pills. Teresa, watching him, asked if she could have a couple. Stanley collapsed at the table within an hour. Teresa fell beside him. 3 members of the same family, in the same house, dead from the same bottle. And at that point, nobody on earth knew yet that the bottle was the thing. The first person who guessed it was a public health nurse named Helen Jensen. She was the public health official for Arlington Heights, the kind of woman who got called when the village wasn't sure what to do. That afternoon, somebody from the Janus family handed her the Tylenol bottle from the kitchen counter and asked if she thought it could be a poisoning. Jensen looked at the bottle. She looked at the receipt taped next to it. The bottle had been bought that morning. 6 pills were missing. 3 Januses were dead. She said very quietly, "I think so." She put the bottle in a paper bag. She drove it to the police. By the next morning, the link had been confirmed. By Friday, the recall went national. By Saturday, every bottle of Tylenol in America was off the shelves. By then, 4 more people had died. Five bottles, 5 stores, 1 afternoon. The Bureau spent the first month of the investigation reconstructing where each contaminated bottle had been bought, when and from which lot. Mary Kellerman's family bought theirs from Jewel Osco in Elk Grove Village. The Janus family bought theirs from a Jewel Osco in Arlington Heights. Mary McFarlane's bottle came from a Walgreens in Lombard. Mary Reiner's bottle came from Frank's Finer Foods in Winfield. Paula Prince's bottle came from a Walgreens at North and Wells in Old Town. 5 different stores, 5 different suburbs. And here's what was strange. The bottles came from different manufacturing lots. They had been made at different Johnson & Johnson plants, on different days, by different machines. That meant whoever had poisoned them had not done it at the factory. That meant whoever had poisoned them had bought the bottles from various stores, taken them somewhere private, doctored them, and put them back. This is called retail tampering. It is the simplest thing in the world to do, and the hardest to investigate. There are no fingerprints because cyanide capsules are handled with gloves. There is no purchase trail because the killer pays cash. There is no witness because anybody who walks into a Walgreens and stands in the headache aisle for 30 seconds is invisible. The Bureau's working theory by mid-October was that the killer had hit the stores all on the same afternoon. He'd planned a route. He'd parked at each store. He'd walked in with his doctored bottles and walked out with the originals, replacing them on the shelves with the cyanide ones, and driven to the next store. 6 suburbs in maybe 4 hours. He'd done it without being seen. He'd done it without being remembered. That's the thing that bothered me most. Not that he was clever, but that he was forgettable. That he understood what kind of person nobody looks at. He'd made himself into furniture. Furniture is hard to catch. Back to the cyanide. Potassium cyanide is not a common poison. It is not something you pull off a hardware store shelf. It is an industrial compound, used in metal plating, in jewelry making, in laboratory chemistry. To get a meaningful quantity in 1982, you needed to know somebody, or to work somewhere, or to have read enough to know how to extract it. The killer had used roughly 1 to 2 grams of potassium cyanide per capsule. That's lethal, with margin to spare. He had measured it. Each contaminated capsule that the FBI later recovered contained approximately the same amount. Most amateur poisoners overdose. They use too much. The capsules don't seal right because they're packed too full, or the powder spills, or it tastes bitter enough that the victim notices in the first second and spits it out. Not this man. He had figured out the dose. He had figured out the technique. Years later, the extortionist James Lewis explained on tape, in painstaking detail, how the killer would have done it. He described drilling a piece of plywood with 12 evenly spaced holes. He described inserting the half shells of empty Tylenol capsules into each hole, open end up. He described brushing the white powder across the board with a kitchen knife so it fell evenly into each shell. He said this in 1987. He said the killer would have, not he had. Lewis was very particular about that distinction. I'd been told once that I didn't always look the part. I let people keep thinking that. I worked the pacifier between my teeth and looked at the photograph of the plywood board. It wasn't an unworkable theory. It was, actually, an elegant one. The dose was the part that proved he wasn't just lucky. The dose was the part that said, this is somebody who'd thought about this for a while. And the tampering itself, the way the bottles were resealed without obvious tampering signs, said something else. Tylenol bottles in 1982 had no tamper-evident seal. There was no foil. There was no shrink wrap. There was a cotton plug at the top, and a cap, and a paperboard box, and that was it. You could pop the cap off, doctor the contents, and put the cap back on, and there was no way for the consumer to tell. That's why he'd picked Tylenol. Not because Johnson & Johnson had wronged him, not because of grievance, because the system was open. He'd looked at how American medicine got from a factory to a person's mouth, and he'd found the gap, and he'd walked through it. On October the 1st, 1982, 2 days after Mary Kellerman died, Johnson & Johnson received a letter. It was typewritten. It was signed nothing. It demanded $1 million, wired to a specific account number at Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago, in exchange for the killings stopping. It read, in part, "It is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since the cyanide is inside the gelatin, it is easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little, and there will be no time to take countermeasures. And, so far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes me less than 10 minutes per bottle." The letter looked like it had been written by the killer. The details checked out. The tone was right. The investigation moved fast. By December 13th, the FBI had arrested the man behind it. His name was James William Lewis. He was 36 years old. He'd been a tax accountant in Kansas City, Missouri, before he'd been a fugitive. He'd been a fugitive because in 1978, he'd been charged with the murder of an elderly client whose dismembered body had been found in his attic. The charges had been dropped on a technicality. He'd lived in at least 3 states under at least 20 aliases. He'd been a chameleon professionally. In late September of 1982, he'd been in New York City with his wife, Broke. His daughter, his only daughter, who'd died at 12 following a heart surgery in 1974, had been on his mind for years. He blamed the makers of the heart sutures used in her surgery, a Johnson & Johnson subsidiary, for her death. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to embarrass Johnson & Johnson. The Tylenol murders gave him one. He typed the letter. He mailed it. He got caught when his fingerprints were found on the envelope. That part was clear. The Bureau had him for extortion in 3 days, charged in 2 months, convicted at trial in 1983. 10 years federal prison. What wasn't clear was whether he'd done the killings. Lewis insisted he hadn't. He said he'd written the letter to direct attention to Johnson & Johnson. He said he'd never been to Chicago at the relevant time. All of that was true. The Bureau had no fingerprints on any of the bottles, no DNA, no eyewitness. They had a man with a motive who fit the profile, who had previously been connected to a dismemberment murder, who knew enough about cyanide and capsules to describe the technique in detail. They had everything except a thing that would stand up in court. They never got that thing. There was another suspect. His name was Roger Arnold. In 1982, he was 48 years old. He worked on the loading dock of a Jewel Osco warehouse in Melrose Park, Illinois, the same supermarket chain whose shelves had carried 2 of the contaminated bottles. Arnold was a regular at a bar in Lincoln Park. The bar's owner, Marty Sinclair, knew him well enough to be alarmed by him. In the weeks after the murders, 2 of Arnold's drinking companions told Sinclair that Arnold had purchased a large quantity of cyanide 6 months before the killings. They said Arnold had been talking, increasingly erratically, about killing people with a white powder. Sinclair called the police. On October 11, 1982, the Chicago police searched Arnold's apartment. They found 5 guns, including a .30 caliber handgun, a rifle, and ammunition. They found books on poisons and explosives, including a copy of The Poor Man's James Bond, a paramilitary handbook that contained, on a specific page, instructions for how to make potassium cyanide. Arnold had a connection to a victim, too. His ex-wife had been treated at a hospital across the street from the Frank's Finer Foods, where Mary Reiner had bought the bottle that killed her. That isn't a smoking gun. That is the kind of degrees of separation Chicago has between any 2 strangers in any given neighborhood. But it had been enough to get him in for questioning. He was held for a few days. He was released. And here's where the story turns into something neither of us wrote. Arnold's co-workers on the loading dock when he came back to work started calling him the Tylenol Kid. It was a joke, a workplace joke. In the summer of 1983, Arnold went to a bar on Lincoln Avenue looking for the man he believed had given his name to the police. He didn't find him. He found a man who looked like him. He shot the wrong man. He killed a stranger named John Stanisha in the parking lot, and then he turned around and went home, and the police arrested him there a few hours later. He was convicted of second-degree murder. He served 15 years. He died in 2008. He never confessed to the Tylenol killings. He went to his grave saying he hadn't done it. Roger Arnold may have been the man. He may not. The case file, when I read it the first time, made him look like he was. The case file, when I read it again 10 years later, made him look like a man who'd been pushed by the wrong rumor at the wrong time and broke. Both can be true. Both probably are. It just depends on what you mean by the word killer. Here's the part of the story you already live in. Pull a bottle of Tylenol off your shelf. Pull any bottle of medicine off your shelf. There's a foil seal under the cap. There's a plastic shrink wrap around the cap. The packaging is sealed in ways that didn't exist before September of 1982. That's because of these murders. In November of 1982, 6 weeks after Mary Kellerman died, the Federal Food and Drug Administration began drafting what would become the Federal Anti-Tampering Act. President Reagan signed it in 1983. Johnson & Johnson, before the FDA had even finished writing the rule, voluntarily redesigned the Tylenol package. By the time the bottles came back to shelves in early 1983, they had 3 layers of seal, a glued box flap, a plastic shrink wrap around the neck of the bottle, a foil seal under the cap, printed with the words "Safety Sealed." Every consumer product package in America followed within 5 years. That is the largest legacy of any cold case I've ever worked. The killer was never caught. He killed 7 people in 3 days, and then he got away clean, and then his actions changed the way 200 million Americans bought medicine, which is the part that keeps me coming back. He didn't do it for money. The extortion letter wasn't from him. The reward was never claimed. He didn't do it for fame. The killer never wrote a letter, never claimed credit, never released a manifesto. The Zodiac wanted his name in the paper. The killer here didn't. He didn't do it for revenge against any one person. The 7 victims were strangers to him, so why? My best guess, after years of looking at it, is that he did it because he could. Because he saw a system that nobody had thought to attack, and he attacked it, just to find out what would happen. The way some men climb mountains. Most criminals are interesting because of why they killed. This one was interesting because he didn't seem to have a why. He was just a man who'd noticed that the door was open and walked through and walked back out. The case didn't end in the spring of '83. I kept the file on my desk. I kept it there a long time. In 1983, there were copycat poisonings. Eye drops in Florida, mouthwash in Colorado. None of them killed anyone. The original man, the Chicago man, never resurfaced. In 2009, federal agents searched James Lewis's home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, taking computers and other evidence. They were looking for any link between Lewis and the original tampered bottles. They didn't find one. In 2011, the FBI requested a DNA sample from Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, because his early bombings had taken place in the Chicago area. The DNA didn't match. In 2025, Netflix released a documentary on the case, including a final interview with Lewis. He died in July of 2023, 2 years before the documentary came out, at the age of 76. In the interview, Lewis denied the killings one more time. Most investigators believed he was lying. Most investigators believed he had killed 7 people in Chicago in 1982. Most investigators couldn't prove it. Roger Arnold died in 2008 in Chicago, never having been formally questioned about the killings again. The bottles are still in evidence. The cyanide samples are still in evidence. The case is still open. It's been open for 43 years. I closed the folder. 7 people died in 3 days in the fall of 1982 because somebody, somewhere in Greater Chicago, had decided to find out what would happen if he did it. Nobody else knew his name. Nobody else, as far as we can tell, ever did. And then he stopped. He never poisoned anything again. He went on with his life, whatever his life was, and a country built itself a new lock on the medicine cabinet because of him. There are cases that end, there are cases that close, and there are cases that just stop being worked. Whoever he is, if he's still alive, he is in his 80s or 90s now. He is somebody's neighbor. He is somebody's grandfather. Or he died somewhere along the way, and nobody at his bedside knew what they had been sitting next to. Either is possible, both are bearable, neither is satisfying. The file closed the way files close, not clean, just closed. Case closed. End of script.